The dilemmas of modernization. International studies is the interdisciplinary study of globalization. Remember, people want peace, but they want it on their own terms. Christian Caryl's book is about the way nations have wrestled with the dilemmas of modernity. What this book does is to show you how every nation's path through modernity zigzags back and forth. People only see straight lines when looking back to write the official history. Caryl's argument is that 1979 is the most important year of the late 20th century. His viewpoint is that of a classical 19th century liberal. The strange rebels of his title were responsible for turning the tide on the post-war wave of collectivization. Thatcher, Deng and the Pope emphasized property rights and market prices and inaugurated an era of prosperity for their peoples. In the case of the Shah of Iran and Afghan communists, it was a matter of moving too fast, too quickly, and inducing uprisings that stopped the clock on progress for decades to come. I want to make a few points about each nation and tell you what to look for. China. Deng Xiaoping's politics were cosmopolitan. He had travelled widely in the West and he had seen what science and technology had to offer China. His famous Southern tour in 1979 and his injunction that it doesn't matter if the cat is black or white as long as it catches mice was an attempt to infuse the communist revolution with entrepreneurial values that resonated with Chinese tradition. Deng's reforms were wildly successful. After a century of humiliation in which China had been overrun and carved out by European powers and then descended into the anarchy of civil war, the largest and oldest of human civilizations was back on its feet again. The coming out party for the new China was the 2008 Beijing Olympics. By the 2010s, China had gone from workshop of the world to laboratory for future technologies like solar energy and artificial intelligence. However, in the long term, Deng's policies were not as successful as Caryl portrays. Deng harshly repressed the student uprising in Tiananmen Square in 1989 and declined a reckoning with Mao's excesses and the Cultural Revolution. Whereas Americans can't stop talking about their 1960s, the Chinese can't talk about their 1960s at all. Whereas Deng's immediate successors were ready to bide their time on the world stage, the latest leader, President Xi, has seized the presidency for life and embarked on a more confrontational course. 5 points to appreciate about China. 1. Why the century of humiliation means the Chinese value order over liberty. 2. How they haven't come to terms with the excesses of Mao. 3. The adjustments they have to make unwinding the one-child policy. 4. Their problem reining in the concrete laying machine. And 5. The thinking behind the South China Seas and Silk Road projects. Iran. Iran is like China. It's a nation with a long and ancient history. In the 1970s, the Shah sought to catapult the Persians into modernity with his White Revolution. He invested in the metropolis and the middle class, but he moved too fast and was swept away by a revolution launched from the mosques and the countryside. The Ayatollah came to power in 1979. It is important for you to grasp that the character of the Ayatollah's revolution was forged by the Iran-Iraq War of 1980 to 1988, fought to a bloody stalemate with epic levels of slaughter and sacrifice. That was the generation that took power. The new regime inherited the extensive security apparatus of the Shah and built out on it. The armed forces became a part of the economy, just as they are in China. Unlike China, however, Iran does have meaningful elections. The regime may choose the candidates, but by convention, the merchants and the middle class get a pick. Usually the opposition candidate wins. The regime has had more trouble when its own candidate won. When he ran again, they had to fix his re-election. They may not have liberal democracy in Iran, but they do have politics and elections. Iran's place on the global stage was penned down by the siege of the American embassy in 1979. Caryl illuminates the origins of the Saudi-Iranian rivalry. The fall of the Shah and the siege of the Grand Mosque in Mecca both occurred in 1979. America switched sides. Before, the Shah had been the key ally in the region. Now it was the House of Saud. On the one side of the Gulf, you have the Persians speaking Farsi and seeking to reconcile Shia Islam and democracy. On the other side, you have an Arab monarchy presiding over the holiest sites of Islam. It's a recipe for a proxy war. 5 points to appreciate about Iran. Number 1, why the revolution is popular even if the regime isn't. Number 2, how the regime was forged by the Iran-Iraq war. Number 3, how Iran is like China with the party controlling the state and the economy. Number 4, but how it is unlike China because Iran has elections and politics. Number 5, why Iran is locked in mortal combat with Saudi Arabia over political leadership of Islam. Afghanistan. Afghanistan is the tragic case among our stories. In the mid-1960s, Kabul was a destination for American hippies. Women wore Western dress and went to university. There was even an Afghan Elvis. Afghanistan was tagging along behind Iran on the road to modernity. Then, one decades-long tragedy after another overwhelmed the country. In 1979, the communists seized power. The Soviets invaded to uphold the new communist regime. The Americans and the Saudis funded the Mujahideen to drive the Soviets out in 1988. Afghanistan descended into civil war in the early 1990s. The Taliban rose in the countryside and conquered the cities in the mid-90s. Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda arrived from Sudan and perpetrated 9/11. The Americans invaded in 2001 and drove the Taliban back into the countryside and across the border into Pakistan. Today, Afghanistan is a burned-out shell of a country with a government that barely controls the nation's cities and is dependent on international aid. It is no longer clear where the Taliban end and the opium smuggling networks begin. After fighting the longest foreign war in American history, the United States is making preparations to leave. India and Pakistan are vying to fill the vacuum. 5 points to appreciate about Afghanistan. Number 1, how topography makes nation building difficult. It's mainly mountains. Number 2, how ethnicity can make it almost impossible. See how the Pashtuns overlap the border? Number 3, some geographies are not conducive to building nation states. You see this over and over again around the world. Number 4, how Afghanistan's fate is a function of Pakistan's relationship with India. And number 5, the stubborn persistence of warlordism in human affairs. It's what floods into the vacuum created by the absence of the state. Poland. Poland's fate is a lesson in how geography matters. The Poles are caught between the Russians on the one side and the Germans on the other. On historical timescales, the country has waxed and waned in size and sometimes almost disappeared. Pope John Paul's visit in 1979 inaugurated the most successful period in Polish history. He bolstered the authority of the Catholic Church, and during the 1980s, the Church sheltered the organizing activities of solidarity. The Polish working class rose up, resisted, and finally, a decade later, overthrew the Soviet-backed state. Poland wasn't the first East European state to fall, but it was the biggest and most important wedge in the Soviet Empire. Poland established a liberal democracy, joined the European Union in 2004, and found a niche in Europe's economy as a supplier of agricultural products and skilled labour. It was the most peaceful and prosperous period in Polish history. That was interrupted in 2012 when Poland's political elite were killed in a plane crash on their way to commemorate the anniversary of a notorious massacre from World War II. Polish nationalism was ignited, and in the years since, Poland has retreated from liberal democracy. Today, the ruling party makes frequent use of anti-immigrant and homophobic appeals, and Poland is a prime example of an illiberal state, a nation with elections, but one in which the ruling party controls the media and the courts. 5 points to appreciate about Poland. Number 1, how geography need not be destiny at all. Number 2, why Poland is East Europe's economic success story. Number 3, how 1979 and 2012 galvanized Polish nationalism but in opposite directions. Number 4, how generation and geography, East and West, divide Poland. And number 5, how modernity can disappoint even when it delivers. Britain! Margaret Thatcher's politics represented one of the most active agents in the story of modernisation, the petty bourgeoisie. When she was elected in 1979, she led a top-down rebellion of the provincial middle class against the metropolis. Her big goal was to break the back of the organised working class by crippling Britain's union movement. She did this by privatising the big utilities the British had taken into public ownership after World War II, and by closing down the mining industry, which had been the seat of Union power. Thatcher's policies had a devastating impact on the British working class, and she might have lost her grip on power had it not been for the Falklands War in 1982. Over the course of the decade, her revolution was a success. Britain went from last to first in the growth league of major European nations, and when Thatcher's term was done, the new balance between private and public sectors was accepted by her Labour successor as Prime Minister, Tony Blair. However, in the long term, Thatcher's policies were not as successful as Caryl portrays. The regions that lost their unionised industries never recovered. When the housing bubble burst in 2008, these regions provided avid recruits for the anti-immigrant, anti-EU party UKIP, the United Kingdom Independence Party. The 4 nations that make up the multinational state of the UK began to pull apart as Scotland sought independence. In 2016, Britain shocked the world by voting in a referendum to withdraw from the EU and turn its back on free trade. 5 points to appreciate about Britain. 1. How the leading states at one stage of industrialisation can become laggards at the next. 2. How come the United Kingdom has 4 nations within one nation state? How is that even possible? Number 3. How nostalgia for empire can linger when nations don't settle their accounts with the past. Number 4. How the bust of 2008 and the rise of social media helped foster anti-immigrant and protectionist sentiment. And number 5. How it has come to pass that the British are the only people in the world who think that combining Brexit with COVID is a good idea. Turning points. 1979 is not the only year you could choose as a turning point in the post-war world. There are other contenders. 1968, America, race riots and assassinations. 1973-4, the Yom Kippur War and the first oil shock. 1979, the Iranian Revolution, the siege of the Grand Mosque and the second oil shock. 1989, Tiananmen Square and the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe. 2001, 9/11. 2008, the financial crash and the Great Recession. 2016, Brexit and Trump's election. 2020, the coronavirus pandemic. It's hard to figure out when the first period of the post-war world ended and the second one started. Is the break 1974, 1979, or 1989? If you're looking at global politics alone, you might pick an earlier date. If you're looking at globalization as a whole, it might be 2001, when China joined the World Trade Organization and Americans began inflating their housing bubble. Periodization of the post-war world is like the concept of region in geography. It's a matter for discussion and the kind of fathoming of geographical and historical currents that is essential to international studies.
I saw you riding round in your brand new automobile. Yes, I saw you riding round, baby, in your brand new automobile.